District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
This episode is brought to you by Unstoppable. Discover the inspiring true story about Anthony Robles, who defied every expectation to become a national wrestling champion in Unstoppable, a new original movie from Amazon MGM Studios and director William Goldenberg, evoking the excitement and camaraderie of classic sports dramas and thrilling wrestling matches. Unstoppable features an all-star ensemble cast, including Jarrell Jerome, Jennifer Lopez, Don Cheadle, Michael Pena, and Bobby Cannavale. Watch Unstoppable now, exclusively on Amazon Prime Video.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Our guests today on the program are two researchers that I have become very fond of in the energy space. It's nice to have some fellow travelers who understand what reliable energy is, why we need to stoop into unreliable energy. We have the energy bad boys, as they call themselves, Isaac Orr and Mitch Rolling, on the podcast. Really thrilled to have you guys on. Why don't you share what you guys do, why your Substack and your reporting work has really exploded onto the scene, especially with people who don't work in our space in energy policy. And then we will go into some of the executive orders by Trump. But I would like you guys to introduce yourselves to listeners who may not be familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Isaac Orr. Mitch Rolling and I have been working together for, it's been a while, Mitch. What, 2018?
Yep.
So we worked at a place called Center of the American Experiment, which is a Minnesota-based think tank. And we worked there for a long time. And then we had an opportunity to start our own policy research organization. So we started Always On Energy Research. And that's where we do the majority of our number crunching in our writing. But we also have a Substack called Energy Bad Boys, which we like it. It really conveys kind of our attitude that we approach to this. We want to take the arguments that, I guess advocates of unreliable energy have, and we want to put the hurt on them. And that's kind of the mentality that we bring to the space on our Substack, especially. Mitch played hockey in high school because he grew up in Minnesota, so of course he played hockey. And he was the goon on his team, and we like to think of ourselves as like the intellectual goons of the energy space. Mitch, did I miss anything?
No, I think that's right. Yeah. And, and it's kind of the energy bad boys is kind of just taking on what the general industry already thinks of us anyways. So it's kind of just like taking on your insulting names, and kind of moving with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So you guys do a lot of modeling of energy policies. I've read some of your stuff with respect to some of the federal regulations, some of the state regulations. You really did examine also, I think one of your recent reports that I read was about Waltz and Minnesota and how much his Green New Deal machinations would cost and how much that would undermine the grid, how much it would bear the costs, on utility prices to residents and consumers and ratepayers. You guys do impressive stuff. So why do you take an interest in doing that? Because it's not sexy work to extrapolate information and data, but you guys make it so digestible and you do a lot of work. Like it takes a lot of gumption to really extrapolate those numbers. So why do you guys like to do that when it's a very daunting task?
I guess we're just gluttons for punishment, and we do think it's sexy. I mean, like, Mitch and I have a lot of fun doing this. And, the fun part is figuring out how to model a policy or a regulation. And sometimes the less fun part is the actual modeling and writing the report and, providing deliverables. But really, we've kind of just like built this model in-house, and we tinker with it all the time to constantly improve it. So for us, that's really the fun part. And it's fun to speak truth to power, and that's the other part. There's so much money and vested interest in propping up wind and solar. It's why the tax credits for those energy resources never go away, and it's why EPA was giving away gold bars off the Titanic to groups that also kind of sing from the same sheet. So, we think it's fun. Mitch, you're the one that crunches the numbers. You think it's fun, right? Or am I just lying to all the people listening to District of Conservation?
Well, no, yeah, and it's kind of like it was like we were doing this stuff between ourselves. When I started working at the center, Isaac and I started working together a lot. And we had on a whiteboard kind of like our list of, enemies to target. And, we would just sit there all day and chatting about how best to go about it, how to bring down Excel. That was kind of like our first, major target. And it just kind of, through talking and having fun like that, like you said, like the talking about it is the fun part. And it kind of just grew into developing a model. And then that model developed into more models, and it started paying off. And so we kind of just went off with it. So it was like the fun part turned into a serious gig, and that's kind of how it went.
You guys have some really top-notch analysis. One of your more recent postings was about Secretary Designate Chris Wright, who I think is such an impressive person. I have not had the pleasure of meeting him, but I love his talk of energy abundance, reliability, portability versus this net zero jargon we've had essentially shoved down our throats for the last 4 years. And we'll talk about Trump getting rid of that posturing with all his blizzard of EOs. But you have that. You guys have a really poignant post about America can save the electric grid or wind and solar grift, not both. Like, you guys have a lot of really interesting commentary, which is why I'll defer people to follow your Substack, of course. But what are you most optimistic for about kind of these next 4 years? Because you've had to report on a lot of bad stuff. What do you think is going to happen, kind of 30,000 foot view with respect to energy policy? Are you encouraged by some of the early action taken by President Trump to really peel back, subsidizing these unreliables, especially solar and wind? I've been encouraged by what I see so far, but I want to hear what your guys' take is.
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic about it. So when the president is truthing out that he doesn't want a single wind turbine built during his administration, that's a real change in the policy winds, if you will, because even as recently as 2016, 2012, Republicans were talking about all of the above. And Mitch and I are really tired of this kind of all above platitude, or all of the above platitudes. Like, we need all of the reliable and affordable power. All of the above is like, it's like an answer that a college student puts on their final exam when they didn't study for it. So I'm really encouraged by that. The thing that makes me kind of temper my hopes and expectations is the fact that, the wind production tax credit has been temporary since 1992. And I was watching Sesame Street when that happened. And Mitch, were you around?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Mitch was just born. Mitch was in diapers.
1991 too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there's a lot of, it's really easy to give a subsidy out to an industry, but it's really hard to take that away, even with the Republican House and Senate. So hopefully, at the very least, I'm optimistic that we can have right now, if a wind turbine repowers itself, or basically repowering is a system where they spend 80, they refurbish the wind turbine. And when they refurbish the wind turbine, they're able to get federal subsidies all over again, because the PTC only lasts for 10 years. So I'm hopeful that we can get rid of the subsidies entirely. But if we can't do that, hopefully we can get rid of loopholes where wind developers are repowering their facilities after 10 or 11 years. Hopefully we can reduce the size of the subsidy or restrict it so it's not wind and solar aren't taking up new prime farmland. So I'm hopeful that certain common sense changes can get made. But Mitch, what are you hopeful for? What do you think?
Well, just right away, day one, it's not bad, for day one stuff, what he's been doing. So that's been great to see. I love the national energy emergency. it's not a permanent solution, right? Like this thing can be taken away. But I do like that in the meantime, it can be used. I'm reading for, keeping retiring plants from closing, which would be great. That'd be awesome. It could be hopefully used for, hopefully building new and coal and nuclear plants. So that'd be great. But I'm going to repeat a lot of what Isaac said, that, this is temporary. A permanent solution would be to repeal the PTC and ITC. That would solve, about 95% of the problems that we have right now. It would solve a lot of the closures. It would solve wind and solar even being built. That's the problem mainly with the all of the above approach, is that when you say all of the above and it includes wind and solar, well, then it includes the subsidies, because wind and solar don't get built without the subsidies. So that's why I mainly have a problem with the all of the above approach. And so I'm hopeful. This is great for day one, but I'm hopeful in the future that, maybe they will repeal the subsidies, because those are the main problem. And, if those aren't repealed, then everything kind of goes back to square one, but I'm hopeful that it might get done.
I agree about the all of the above rhetoric. And I don't know if you guys are connected to Andre Bellevue of Commonwealth Foundation. He and I have been pushing in printed form or digital printed form, arguing against that and more so pivoting, like you said, to an abundance mindset, to reliable kind of rhetoric, because it is a concession to net zero. We make the argument that we're really conceding to the net zero proponents by saying we support the catalyzing or utility scale kind of expansion of solar and wind, which are not proven to work. They're extremely costly. They don't even, they can't even come to fruition or work a fraction of the time. They're very bad on the landscape, bad, production of electricity, very limited source. It can't power the grid, essentially is what it is. And it's bad for the environment, all things considered. And the Unleashing American Energy executive order was really interesting. I don't know if you guys read through that one as well, but it said that Trump would pause any disbursements of subsidies or climate funding to the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So hopefully that also means these projects, which are now kind of in a standstill, especially onshore, offshore wind, they're not going to get any more funding, because Trump sees that the government was picking winners and losers. They're not dispatchable. They're very expensive, even without subsidies. And they have a lot of ruinous qualities to them.
Mm. Yeah, I hadn't heard the part about suspending the IRA subsidies. I think that's pretty badass. Can I say that on the podcast?
Yes,
Do you need
can,
to go
of
back
course.
and bleep it?
No,
okay,
no.
Of
course you can
I wanted
say that.
to follow the protocol.
Of course. No, I don't know how much of the orders you saw. I mean, I talked with Andre before hopping on with you guys about the Paris Climate Accords. I mean, there's so much, it's so hard to keep track of. But what was so interesting too about this wind project moratorium, because like you guys, I have investigated, I've done a lot of video reports. I have one coming out soon about Wyoming. Red states are even falling prey to this offshore or onshore wind, kind of gambit and gamble. But Lava Ridge is one I investigated and brought into the forefront. Jesse Waters picked up our coverage of my Conservation Nation report. I think we could say that, I think we say privately amongst my clients that we kind of helped usher in the legislature to pass a memorandum to not build the project. So I'm very invested in a project like that not coming to fruition. And it's very exciting to see that they've even paused that from ever potentially coming on board. This also applies to offshore wind. And I was seeing some coalition letters going around by supposed fellow travelers of free market environmentalism, who said that we can't agree with President Trump's executive order because then it tips the scales against wind and it's not neutral and really hampers the market. But it's a course correction, because right now it's the government favoring artificially wind over actual reliable power sources.
Right.
Yeah, I hate arguments like that. Mitch, do you want to talk about how much you hate them, and then I can talk about it?
Well, I was just going to say that would make more sense if the scales weren't already tipped for wind and solar. So I get what they're saying, right? You don't want to pick them, but we're already picking the winners. And so you do have to, like you said, course correct. So I don't agree with that position at all.
There's also, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, and the thing about it is, like, you have the EPA that's breathing down the throat of every coal plant that's existing on the grid. They want to shut it down by 2040 at the latest, unless they install unproven carbon capture and sequestration technology. EPA is also promulgating these regulations on gas that say if you operate above a 40% capacity factor, you have to either have CCS or clean hydrogen. Like, to think that there is somehow a persecution of wind energy is just the most insane policy position that you could take, because not only are we subsidizing them with taxpayer dollars, and we have been since, I thought Grover was the bee's knees, but the EPA is constantly kicking out the supports from other energy sources too. So the government is actively picking losers at the expense of the winners in the market. So I think that those arguments are bad, and we should name and shame the people who are making them.
It might even come to a couple Republicans. I think in a professional capacity, I was telling Andre this in our recording. I think a bunch of us who believe consistently in reliable energy and an abundance mindset, we have to remind some of these straggler Republicans that supporting projects funded by the IRA, even if they didn't vote for it, is not a very tenable position to take, especially if you're in support of President Trump's energy abundance agenda. I don't know why there would be 20 outstanding members saying we're open to keeping some of it, even if we didn't vote for it, because our districts will benefit. Your districts are not benefiting from this. Locals are opposing solar and wind projects like no tomorrow, consistently.
Right. Well, and it will increase the total system cost. It doesn't matter if it's being passed on to taxpayers. It's not benefiting them in the long run, because you're not prioritizing affordability in the total system cost, and it's going to deteriorate reliability over time. And that's something that we talk about a lot. Like, you might see the money coming up front through the subsidies right away, but you're going to be paying for that years down the road when all of your thermal reliable power plants are off the grid.
Talk about some of your recent writings. So you guys have noted, of course, you can't choose the grid and also solar and wind. You've found that in your estimation that solar and wind are up to 12 times more expensive than natural gas in New England. The cost of going green in New England is $815 billion and so forth. So some of your recent reporting, what would you guys like to highlight for listeners to know, especially in these areas that have really dipped their toes into net zero?
Yeah, just some basic stuff. But when we do a report like that, it's always very system specific, and it's always predicated on the assumptions that lawmakers are doing whenever they're passing this legislation. So, I don't want everybody to say, oh, well, this is a blanket statement for every area of the country, because it really is pretty nuanced. But ultimately, what people need to know is they're constantly hearing that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of power, right? You have Lazard, you've got every wind and solar advocacy group that makes that point. But the problem with that is it doesn't consider the difference between cost and value. So Secretary Wright, or he will be Secretary Wright, made a really good point in his hearing where he said, okay, if you could have an Uber that cost you $25 that's powered by solar and wind, and there's one that's $28 powered by coal or natural gas, but you're not sure if the one that's powered by wind and solar is going to show up on time to take you to your destination, which one are you going to book, right? So there's so many hidden costs that go into making wind and solar reliable. You have to have battery storage, you have more transmission lines, you have more utility profits and property taxes. So when we do an analysis like this, we take all of these hidden costs that wind and solar advocates tend to downplay if they ever acknowledge them. So that's why you have such a large discrepancy in the cost of what a Lazard's levelized cost of energy analysis might provide and what we calculate based on hourly system costs. So or hourly system demands. So, Mitch, I don't know if you want to get into that or talk about what the final cost of offshore wind and onshore wind were in the New England report and how you crunched the numbers. I don't know if you care about the nerd stuff, Gabby.
I do. Please,
okay,
enlighten me and my listeners.
We can do nerd stuff.
Yeah. Well, like Isaac said, we want to look at the hidden costs, and I like to call them the system costs, the cost of maintaining system reliability with wind and solar. And the reason why that's different from Lazard is because Lazard, like, those typical LCOEs only look at a single plant. And we're looking at how the entire resource acts on the system. And so it captures everything needed to maintain that system reliability in the absence of a thermal reliable grid. And so you have to overbuild a ton in both wind and solar, but also battery storage. And so our load balancing and overbuilding and curtailment metrics in our LCOE graphs, that's what that's accounting for, the battery storage and the overbuilding that you need to maintain reliability. And so, that's the main reason why ours are so much larger than typical LCOEs, because we're addressing that total system, not just one single plant.
Tell me your guys' thoughts on nuclear energy. I've seen your reporting on European countries such as Germany completely botching their grids, pivoting to nothing wrong with coal, but they would rather go back to coal than keeping nuclear, which is kind of funny. Do you think that with America prioritizing energy independence again, we could export some of those values and ideals to our European counterparts? My family's from Lithuania, which is a Baltic country, and they're fully going energy independent of Russia. First, they've done it from imports of oil and gas. Now they're fully divesting from their electric grid. I think, formerly occupied communist countries understand what's going on and not to rely on others. But Western Europe is still misguided, not understanding of things. So what is your reading into that? First nuclear, and then also, do you think we can export American energy ideals across the world?
Mitch, why don't you go first this time?
So yeah, I am hopeful about that. Which was one reason why I like, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, to not only have our energy policy not driven by Europe and other foreign countries, but to showcase America energy leadership and to hopefully pull others in the same direction. So yeah, I had that same thought. I'm not too sure if it will, but I'm more concerned about us just kind of showing our leadership, but hopefully others will follow in the long run.
Yeah, I kind of think you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And I think that that's where Western Europe is, and Eastern Europe. They know what it's like to be under the boot of communism. And Hoffman is a very Eastern European last name, Gabby. I think that it was obvious your family was from Lithuania.
That's the Jewish side, but I also have Lithuanian side too. So best of both worlds. Yeah.
Gotcha. There you go. But we like nuclear, but we're not in love with nuclear. So I think that when we are doing our cost calculations, if you're trying to decarbonize your grid, nuclear offers the most reliable and often the most affordable way of doing that. You can pair it with batteries if you really want to go carbon free, or you can use natural gas as kind of a peaking resource, and you can do it a lot cheaper that way. But, for all the optimism that we have about nuclear power right now, we need to be honest with people about the fact that it is going to increase the cost of electricity, because building these new plants is going to be expensive, even if we don't have the kind of cost overruns or delays that we saw in Georgia with Plant Vogtle. So, we're optimistic that certain types of power plants, like South Korea builds one called the APR 1400, and they can build that for $60 a megawatt hour, depending on the circumstances, and that's pretty awesome. In terms of carbon-free, reliable power, that's a bargain. But when you're comparing that to the cost of an existing coal plant that can produce electricity for $32 a megawatt hour, or an existing gas plant, depending on gas prices, maybe you're down in like the $18 to $25. It's going to be inflationary, and it's just a question of, okay, do the people who say they care about climate change actually care about climate change? And will they support nuclear? Or are they kind of just anti-fossil fuel advocates, and they're anti-fossil fuel because they see that as punishing their political opposition? I think depending on how cynical, you can take either position on that. But maybe nuclear provides a hedge or maybe it doesn't based on, what's actually fueling the opposition. Is it kind of like a degrowther? We don't want any kind of industrial progress, or is it actually a legitimate concern about emissions and the impact on warming? It's a Rorschach test.
I come about support for nuclear not from the decarbonization standpoint. Like, I do like its benefits, that it does promise to be zero emissions, but I don't take it from the view of decarbonization, because I think that's a really foolhardy position, because any technology that is latched onto this premise of net zero is always doomed to fail, which is why I think it's important to decouple nuclear from net zero, so you don't doom that technology from coming back online, and you don't doom its prospects in the private sector or in the financial markets, because now everyone is looking to invest after many, many years of being told it's very bad, poor return on investment if you go big into nuclear. But I think you're right. Like, there is hesitation, understandably so, to do it because it is tied to decarbonization, which I don't want it to be, because I think nuclear can work, once it has a lot of the means to work, once you cut back red tape, once you deregulate in that space, and it does become a little cheaper. But do you think it would take reforming the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, other types of, permitting reform? What would it take to really unleash nuclear, given these concerns you've laid out?
I think that's a great question for Jack Spencer over at the Heritage Foundation, who just wrote a book on this topic. But I guess I will add a couple asterisks to what I was saying earlier. The existing nuclear power plants in this country operate very affordably. So they're operating at anywhere between, what is it, Mitch? Anywhere between $20 and $35 a megawatt hour. So essentially, once the nuclear plant is paid off, it produces very low cost, reliable power for up to 80 years. And that's really great. So ultimately, I think what needs to happen is we just need to build some of these plants, and they need to, they call it depreciation in utility speak. But ultimately what that means is they pay off their mortgage. And as they pay off their mortgage over time, they become lower cost assets. It's kind of like existing coal plants. So, and then the other thing that makes nuclear promising, and it is potentially the only energy source I think that could be lower cost than fossil fuel in the future, because a AAA battery's worth of uranium produces as much electricity as, I think it's a ton of coal. So, the energy density is something that is very impressive. So, Jack Spencer will give you the answers you need in terms of what needs to get done at the federal level to streamline nuclear permitting. But, I think from a physics standpoint, the promise is there.
I did see in one of the executive orders, I believe it was the Unleashing American Energy one, to really streamline minerals processing, refining, production. I believe Trump has indicated interest in shoring up uranium deposits, because we're sitting on a treasure trove of them here in Virginia. I know we have a big deposit somewhere in the southwestern corridor, and right now we're importing. It's like criminal that we're taking in 50% of uranium from Russia. Makes no sense to me. And we sit on so many deposits, unexplored, but potential deposits here. So you're not wrong on that too, with respect to that. But it is interesting. And I know there's going to be debate, like, how do we shore up nuclear? I think you guys have some very interesting insights. And like I said, I think it would be doomed if it is tied to this move away from fossil fuels pivot. I think we can have fossil fuels and nuclear. I don't think the two have to be at odds, because right now, after natural gas, it's nuclear as the second largest source of electricity generation. And then I think coal is the third biggest one, if I'm not mistaken. So all of those work together to supply most of our electricity in the country. They don't have to be at odds with one another.
Right. And I think part of our thing, if when we're talking about nuclear, if we say, if you want to replace a coal plant with a nuclear plant, we're talking about decades down the line, when, we argue for utilizing our existing grid until we can't anymore. And because that's going to be the cheapest way to go about this. So you're right. Everything needs to work together. And if you want to transition the grid to nuclear, we're talking about a 50 to 100-year process. We're not doing it by 2030. And so I think that's a major thing to consider when we're talking about our nuclear portfolios. We're not necessarily advocating for it, but we are suggesting that it's a better way than wind and solar. For cost and reliability, Isaac mentioned before that the costs do increase with a nuclear portfolio, but over time those do go down. So even without decarbonization in your mind, like nuclear has the prospects of being affordable and reliable, similar to coal, and wind and solar just don't offer that.
Why don't you? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to add nuclear plants and coal plants are great because they both have a lot of fuel stored on site. And, we saw during Elliott, we saw during Uri, sometimes natural gas distribution gets disrupted and the power plants aren't able to produce power. So we think that there are like grid values that aren't necessarily captured in the monetary cost of nuclear power plants that, if you're going to shut down the coal plant, maybe you don't replace it all with gas. I think nuclear is a good hedge. But go ahead. What were you going to ask?
Oh, no, I wanted to round out the conversation on a very positive note, asking you both to make a plug for your company, Always on Energy Research. What do you guys do and what services do you guys offer that might interest my listeners?
Oh, man. Thanks for giving us the time to plug it. So they can go to aoenergy.org and see a list of what we do. But we do a lot of modeling of EPA regulations, and our clients include state agencies. We've got a hedge fund that's asking us about what we can do to help them understand the market price of electricity moving forward. Industry players sometimes ask us what we think about this or that regulation, what it's going to cost, with the impact that it's going to have on grid reliability. So if you're interested in figuring out the cost or reliability implications of a federal or state policy, or if you're in Canada and you want to ask us about a provincial policy, we can probably get that done for you.
Fabulous. Is there anything else that you guys want to quickly plug in before we finish our wonderful conversation? I've learned a lot even beyond what I basically know. You guys are very knowledgeable from the grid standpoint, and sometimes it's really hard to extrapolate this data. I'm glad you guys are doing this hard work where we try to take your pivotal research and translate it more simply for the audiences to understand. But you guys do a very daunting work very, very well. So anything else you want to plug in?
No, but if you subscribe to Energy Bad Boys, you'll get a little taste of this conversation. Not quite every week right now, but most every week. So thanks for having us on, Gabby. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Anytime. Of course, in the show notes, we will have all the links that were referenced here. A big plug, of course, to your guys' Substack. Highly recommend that everyone reads it. I like to read your dispatches. I will try to read more often. So it helps me with my policy work and just expanding my knowledge. Really appreciate you both coming on. Any way that I could be helpful to you, please let me know, because we all got to stick together, fighting net zero, because we're going to still face resistance even from some on our side. So more than happy to be in this fight with you guys, and let me know how I could be helpful to you as well.
Perfect.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.